Chapter 1. The Outbreak. The Georgia summer heat pressed down on Tom Harrison like a suffocating blanket. Sweat traced lines down his weathered face as he adjusted his safety harness, scanning the Savannah rooftop he was repairing. At 42, years of military service and subsequent roofing work had taught him to always stay alert. The distant wail of sirens caught his attention. Not unusual for a city, but something felt different today. His military-honed instincts prickled with an undefined sense of unease. Jake, his foreman, called up from below. "Tom, you hear those sirens? Seems like something's going down." Tom adjusted his tool belt, eyes scanning the street. Normally bustling with midday traffic, the road now looked eerily quiet. A sedan sat abandoned, driver's side door hanging open. In the distance, a figure stumbled, moving with an unnatural jerky gait. "Something's wrong," Tom muttered, reaching for his smartphone. The local newsfeed confirmed his suspicions. Initial reports were fragmented and chaotic, accounts of violent attacks, people displaying inexplicable aggressive behavior. Words like unknown virus and potential outbreak scrolled across the screen. A blood-curdling scream erupted from the street below. Tom's head snapped down, just in time to see a woman being attacked by a man. No, not a man. Something was fundamentally wrong with his movement, his attack. Teeth were sinking into flesh with animalistic ferocity. "Jake, get in the truck, now!" Tom's military command voice cut through the ambient noise. But Jake was already moving, his face ashen. More screams erupted. Cars screeched. In the distance, smoke began rising from multiple locations. Tom's training kicked in. Military protocols ingrained since his Special Forces days surfaced: assess, secure, survive. His home wasn't just a house. It was a fortified compound designed for precisely this type of scenario. As they drove, the city transformed. Panic spread like wildfire. People ran in all directions. Some attacked each other with shocking brutality. Traffic lights blinked uselessly as abandoned vehicles blocked intersections. "What the hell is happening?" Jake whispered, gripping the steering wheel. "Pandemic. Possible biological event," Tom responded clinically. "We need to get to my place and lock down." His compound sat on the city's outskirts, 5 acres surrounded by reinforced fencing, solar power, water filtration, and enough supplies to sustain multiple people for months. Tom had always been prepared, a habit from his military days. They pulled into the compound just as chaos truly erupted. Military helicopters thundered overhead. Emergency broadcasts blared from car radios and storefront speakers. Citizens are advised to stay indoors. Do not approach infected individuals. Repeat, do not approach infected individuals. Tom's neighbor Jim burst through the gate. Normally a skeptical real estate agent more concerned with property values than survival, Jim looked terrified. "Tom, what's happening?" Jim's voice cracked. Before Tom could answer, a grotesque scene unfolded across the street. A middle-aged man, clearly infected, was attacking a jogger, moving with inhuman speed and savagery. "Inside, now!" Tom's tone brooked no argument. Within minutes, they were secure. Tom activated his compound's defense systems: electronic perimeter monitoring, reinforced windows, communication jammers. Years of military planning were now being put to the ultimate test. As night fell, the sounds of civilization collapsed: screams, gunshots, the occasional helicopter, but mostly an unnatural silence punctuated by distant, inhuman moans. Tom looked at Jake and Jim, their faces illuminated by emergency lighting. "We're going to survive this," he said. "But we can't just think about ourselves. There are others out there who will need help." Little did they know how prophetic those words would become, or the challenges that awaited them in the days to come. The zombie apocalypse had begun. Tom sat in his fortified home, the glow of multiple monitors casting shadows on the walls. The news anchors were panicked, their voices cracking as they described the chaos spreading across the globe. Discord feeds buzzed with frantic messages, and his Facebook feed was a constant stream of desperation and misinformation. He ignored most of it, focusing instead on the live footage from his surveillance cameras. The AR-15 lay on the table before him, loaded and ready. Several extra magazines sat neatly beside it, his version of popcorn for any unwelcome guests. A sharp vibration broke his concentration. His phone lit up with another text. Friends and family from all over the country were checking in. Most were scared, asking him what to do. Tom answered as best as he could: "Stay inside, stay quiet, don't trust anyone." Then the phone buzzed again, this time with a call. The name on the screen made his stomach sink. Mark, one of his employees. Tom answered. "Mark, what's going on?" The voice on the other end was frantic. "Tom, I need help. They're surrounding the house. I don't know how much longer the door's gonna hold. The family and I are hiding in the basement. Can you—" The line went dead. Tom stared at the phone, his jaw tightening. His common sense screamed at him to stay put. For this scenario, he'd fortified his home to ride out the storm, not chase after it. But Mark wasn't just an employee. Tom treated his crew like family. He couldn't sit by and do nothing. With a resigned sigh, Tom stood, grabbed his vest, and slung the AR-15 over his shoulder. He loaded 10 extra ammo sticks into his bag and then grabbed his keys. The truck engine roared to life, and he punched in the gate code, watching the steel barrier slide open. He drove toward Lamar Heights, the roads eerily quiet at first. But as he neared the district, the chaos became undeniable. The W. Duren Highway was a graveyard of abandoned and crashed vehicles. Tom gritted his teeth, gripping the wheel as he maneuvered onto the side roads. Here the scenery grew darker. Cars with shattered windows, debris littering the streets, and bodies, some still, others twitching with grotesque spasms. The air reeked of smoke. When he reached Mark's street, he parked several houses down, turning off the engine to avoid drawing attention. His AR-15 was equipped with a suppressor, scope, and mounted light. Tom scanned the area through the scope. The front of Mark's house was under siege. A dozen zombies clawed at the door, their grotesque faces smearing blood on the wood. The door held for now. Tom took a deep breath, his fingers steady on the trigger. One by one, he picked them off. The suppressor muffled the shots, the only sound a faint pop as each bullet found its mark. The bodies slumped to the ground, the pile growing. When the last one dropped, Tom moved quickly. "Mark, open up!" he yelled as he reached the porch. There was no response. Cursing under his breath, Tom circled to the back of the house. More stragglers wandered the yard, their heads jerking unnaturally as if controlled by broken strings. Tom dispatched them with precision, the blood splattering across the grass. Finally, the back door creaked open, and Mark emerged, his wife clutching 2 small children behind him. "Let's go," Tom said, waving them toward the truck. "We need to move now." The kids were crying softly, their faces buried in their mother's arms. Mark nodded, his face pale and drawn. "Thank you, Tom. I didn't think we'd make it." "Save it," Tom snapped. "Just get in the truck." As they sped away, the wife spoke up, her voice trembling. "We need food. The babies, they're hungry. I didn't have time to pack anything." Tom shot her a sharp look in the rearview mirror. "Are you serious?" he muttered. But he couldn't let any kid starve, no matter how much it complicated things. "Fine, we'll stop at Hebersham Shopping Center. It's close." The shopping center was chaos. People ran in and out of stores, carts piled high with supplies. Others fought in the parking lot over scraps, their screams blending with the distant groans of the undead. Tom pulled up near the entrance and cut the engine. "I'll watch the truck. Mark, get in and out fast. Wait, take this." He handed Mark a Glock. "You never know what's waiting for you." Mark nodded, shaking his hands as he took the weapon. He disappeared into the store, leaving Tom to scan the perimeter. Every shadow and sound set his nerves on edge. The AR-15 rested on his lap, his finger hovering near the trigger. Minutes passed like hours. When Mark finally emerged, he was carrying a bag of supplies. But as he stepped through the sliding doors, a bloodied hand shot out, grabbing his arm. The zombie's guttural moan cut through the air, sending a chill down Mark's spine. Mark screamed, firing wildly. The shots missed, ricocheting off the pavement. The zombie's jaws snapped inches from his face. Suddenly, its head snapped to the side, the wall behind it painted red. Tom lowered his rifle, smoke curling from the suppressor. "Get up, you idiot," Tom barked. "Run!" Mark scrambled to his feet, his legs burning as he sprinted to the truck. He threw himself into the passenger seat, gasping for breath. I thought I was." "Save it," Tom growled, slamming on the gas. The truck roared to life, tearing out of the parking lot. The sun dipped below the horizon as they sped through the streets, the shadows lengthening and twisting. The city was changing, the night bringing with it new horrors. Tom gripped the wheel, his jaw clenched. This was only the beginning. The truck's headlights cut through the encroaching darkness, casting long shadows that danced eerily along the sides of the road. The silence in the cab was heavy, broken only by the occasional sob of Mark's wife or the low hum of the engine. Tom fixed his eyes on the road, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. The AR-15 rested within reach, its cold metal comforted in a chaotic world. "How much farther?" Mark asked, his voice tight with fear. Tom didn't answer immediately. He was scanning the road ahead, the shadows playing tricks on his vision. Finally, he grunted, "About 5 miles. But it's going to feel like 50 at this rate." The congested roads forced him to take back streets, many littered with abandoned cars and debris. Each turn felt like a gamble. The undead were out there, and so were other dangers. He glanced in the rearview mirror at Mark's kids, their broad, tear-streaked faces pressed against their mother's chest. He couldn't let them down. The first sign of trouble came on a narrow stretch of road flanked by tall oaks. A flickering fire ahead illuminated the silhouettes of several figures. Tom slowed the truck, his heart sinking. "What is it?" Mark whispered. "Blockade," Tom muttered. "Stay quiet." As they drew closer, it became clear that this wasn't an accident. A group of men armed with bats and makeshift weapons stood in front of a barricade made from overturned cars and debris. They wore tattered clothes, their faces shadowed but radiating hostility. Tom stopped the truck a safe distance away. One man stepped forward, casually holding a shotgun across his shoulder. "Evenin'," the man drawled. "Road's closed. Gonna have to pay a toll to get through." Tom's jaw tightened. "We don't want any trouble. Just let us pass." The man smirked. "Trouble's already here, friend. Now, step out of the truck. Let's have a chat." Mark's wife whimpered, clutching her children tighter. Tom reached for the AR-15, his movements slow and deliberate. "Stay put," he said over his shoulder. Then, opening the door, he stepped out into the night. The tension was suffocating. Tom kept the rifle low but ready, his finger resting near the trigger. The men eyed him, their expressions shifting from smug to wary. The leader's shotgun tilted slightly, and the barrel pointed in Tom's direction. "We don't have anything for you," Tom said, calm but firm. "Move the barricade, and we'll be on our way." The leader sneered. "See, that's not how this works. You got a nice truck, supplies, and maybe even some ammo. Hand it over, and we'll let you walk away." Tom's eyes flicked to the others. They were closing in, their weapons gripped tightly. His pulse quickened, the old instincts kicking in. Years of combat flooded back, the memories sharp and unforgiving. "I'm giving you one chance," Tom said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "Let us through." The leader laughed, a harsh, guttural sound. "Or what? You gonna shoot me?" The first shot rang out before the man finished his sentence. The suppressor muffled the sound, but the effect was immediate. A mist of red exited the back of the leader's head. The leader dropped, blood pooling beneath him. The others froze, stunned by the sudden violence. "Anyone else?" Tom growled, his rifle trained on the nearest man. Panic set in. The group scattered, some running into the woods, others hiding behind the barricade. Tom backed toward the truck, his rifle still raised. He climbed in, slamming the door. "What happened?" Mark asked, his voice shaking. "We're moving," Tom said curtly. He gunned the engine, ramming the barricade. The truck jolted as debris scattered, and they sped through the gap. The relief was short-lived. Less than a mile down the road, they hit another impasse. Cars were piled up, blocking the entire street. Beyond the wreckage, Tom could see movement, a horde of zombies swarming through the gridlock. "We're walking from here," Tom said, pulling over. Mark's wife gasped. "But the kids—" "There's no other way," Tom said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Grab what you can carry. Stay close to me." He retrieved his vest and slung the AR-15 over his shoulder. He handed Mark a flashlight and extra magazines. "Keep your eyes open. No mistakes." The night was alive with unsettling sounds, distant screams, the guttural moans of the undead, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. They moved quickly but carefully, weaving through the wreckage. Tom took point, his rifle sweeping back and forth. Halfway home, they encountered the first zombie. It emerged from behind a wrecked sedan, its milky eyes on the group. Tom fired, the suppressor ensuring their location stayed hidden. The creature dropped, its head snapping back as the bullet tore through its skull. "Keep moving," Tom urged. The group pressed on, the children's whimpers muffled by their mother's embrace. But the undead weren't the only threat. As they rounded a corner, a figure stepped out from the shadows, a knife glinting in his hand. "Drop the gun," the man snarled. "Now." Tom's heart pounded. He could see the desperation in the man's eyes, or just a man trying to take advantage of the situation. But desperation made people dangerous. "Don't do this," Tom said evenly. "You don't want to go down this road." The man lunged. Tom reacted instinctively, his combat skills taking over. The shot was quick and precise, the man crumpling to the ground. Mark stared, his face pale. You killed him," he stammered. "He gave me no choice," Tom said, his voice hollow. The weight of the act settled heavily on him, the PTSD roaring to the surface. For a moment, he was back in the desert, the screams of his comrades echoing in his ears. He forced the memories down, focusing on the task at hand. "Let's move," he said, his voice rough. By the time they reached the neighborhood, the group was exhausted. The children were nearly asleep in their mother's arms, and Mark's steps were sluggish. Tom led them to his gate, punching in the code. The steel barrier slid open, and they stumbled inside. Once the gate locked behind them, Tom let out a long breath. "We're safe, for now." Mark sank to the ground, his hands trembling. I don't know how to thank you." Tom didn't respond. He couldn't shake the image of the man he'd killed, the way his body had crumpled like a puppet with its strings cut. He'd done what he had to, but it didn't make it any easier. As the others settled in, Tom stood by the monitors, watching the cameras. The night was far from over, and deep down, he knew this was only the beginning of the horrors they'd face. The bunker's air was heavy with silence, broken only by the hum and the occasional whisper of static from the radio. Mark's wife and children huddled together in the corner, their faces pale but calm. The secure underground shelter had become their refuge, a cocoon of safety in a hostile world. Tom sat at the surveillance desk, his eyes glued to the multiple feeds showing the perimeter of his property. The screens displayed nothing but stillness. The empty yard, the closed gate, the shadowy tree line beyond. For now, the chaos remained outside their fortress. Mark leaned against the wall nearby, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "Anything?" he asked. Tom shook his head. "Nothing. It's quiet out there." Mark exhaled sharply. Too quiet. The days blended into each other. With the cell towers down, their phones were useless, except as reminders of the lives they had lost contact with. However, the internet was still functioning, though no one could say for how long. People continued to upload videos and post frantic messages. Tom watched them in his spare time, though each post felt like another nail in the coffin of humanity. One video showed a family barricaded in their home, their windows boarded up. The father spoke directly to the camera, his voice trembling as he begged for help. In the background, something slammed against the door. The video cut off abruptly. Another post was a live stream from a group of survivors holed up in a grocery store. They laughed nervously, trying to make the best of their situation. Tom refreshed the page later, only to find the stream had ended with a final, cryptic message. They got in. Mark sat beside him during one of these grim sessions, his face pale. "Why do you watch that stuff?" "Keeps me sharp," Tom replied, not looking away from the screen. "Reminds me what's out there." Mark didn't respond. He returned to his post, watching the monitors with tired eyes. They had settled into a routine, taking shifts monitoring the surveillance system. They'd trade places every few hours, one resting while the other kept watch. The bunker's isolation was both a blessing and a curse. It kept them safe, but left them alone with their thoughts. By the end of day 5, the tension in the bunker had become almost unbearable. The lack of activity outside should have been reassuring, but instead it felt ominous. The silence was too complete, the calm too unnatural. Tom sat at the surveillance desk, his AR-15 resting across his lap. The rifle had become an extension of himself, always within reach, always ready. He hadn't slept much since they arrived back at the house. His mind wouldn't let him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the man he'd killed at the barricade. The memory haunted him. The look of surprise and pain froze on the man's face. He'd done what he had to. He knew that. But the knowledge didn't make it any easier. "You should rest," Mark said, breaking the silence. Tom glanced at him. "I'm fine." Mark frowned. "You've been at it for hours. You're going to burn out." "I'll rest when it's safe." Mark didn't argue. He knew better. Instead, he turned his attention back to the monitors. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the faint buzz of the screens and the soft breathing of Mark's family. As the fifth day drew to a close, Tom sat in the dim light of the bunker, scrolling aimlessly through Facebook. Most of the posts were old, with the same pleas for help and desperate updates he'd seen. He was about to shut it off when a new message popped up in a local group he'd joined years ago. The post was simple but chilling. "Is anyone out there? We're out of food. Please help." The message was accompanied by a blurry photo of a man and a young boy huddled together in what looked like a basement. The walls were cracked and damp, and the boy's face was streaked with dirt. The post had only been up for a few minutes, but already there were comments. "Where are you? Can anyone help them? Stay strong. Prayers coming your way." Tom stared at the screen, his chest tightening. He'd seen countless posts like this over the past few days, but something about this hit him harder. Maybe it was the boy, who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Or perhaps it was how the man's eyes looked in the photo, haunted and hollow, like he'd already accepted they were doomed. Mark leaned over, reading the message. "You're not thinking about—" "No," Tom said quickly, but the truth was, he was thinking about it. The post had ignited something in him, a spark of the man he used to be, the man who couldn't turn his back on someone in need. But that man had been broken, left behind in the sands of a faraway desert. "It's suicide," Mark said. "You know that, right?" Tom nodded, his jaw clenched. "Yeah, I know." He closed the laptop and stood, the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a physical force. He couldn't save everyone. He'd learned that the hard way. But the knowledge didn't make it easier to ignore the cries for help. As he turned off the lights and settled in for another restless night, the image of the boy's face lingered in his mind. The world outside was dark and hopeless, but as long as people were left to fight, Tom knew he couldn't give up. Not yet. Alan and Frank sat in Tom's Roofing's dimly lit main office. The once busy hub of their workday was now a fortress of desperation. The windows and doors were barricaded with plywood and furniture. Still, every creak of the wind outside made their nerves fray further. Each of them clutched a roofing hatchet, the metal gleaming faintly in the soft glow of a battery-powered lantern. "We're running out," Alan muttered, his voice low. He gestured to the dwindling stash of supplies on the desk, 3 bottles of water and a handful of energy bars. "This won't last us another 2 days." Frank, a wiry man with a weathered face, sighed heavily. "I know, but what can we do? It's not like the trucks are running deliveries anymore." Alan leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "What about Tom's place? He's got that bunker, stocked to the rafters with food and water. You think he made it?" Frank smirked. Knowing Tom, he's probably standing guard on his roof, AR-15 in hand, daring the zombies to step onto his lawn. They both chuckled, though the sound was hollow. The thought of Tom, their stoic and resourceful boss, brought a sliver of hope. If anyone could survive this mess, it was him. "All right," Alan said, sitting up straighter. "We'll pack what we have left. At first light, we head to Tom's. It's a full day's walk, and we'll need every bit of daylight we can get." Frank nodded, already gathering their supplies. They stuffed the remaining water bottles and energy bars into a worn backpack, checked their hatchets, and settled in for a restless night. The first light of dawn painted the horizon in shades of orange and pink. Alan and Frank stepped out of the office, the air heavy with the scent of smoke and burning plastic. They moved cautiously down Waters Ave, their path taking them past Memorial Health University Medical Center. The massive complex was surrounded by white body bags piled high, a makeshift mass grave. The unmistakable hum of flies filled the air. The hospital's facade bore the scars of combat, bullet holes, shattered windows, and the remnants of hastily abandoned military vehicles. "Looks like the army tried to hold it," Alan said, his voice low. "They didn't hold it long," Frank replied, stepping over a discarded helmet. They hurried past, the sight too grim to linger on. As they reached the grounds of Calvary Day School, they froze. Behind the tall, wrought-iron security fence, a dozen child zombies wandered aimlessly. Their tiny bodies, dressed in torn uniforms, bumped into each other as they clawed at the air. Alan's grip tightened on his hatchet. "Keep moving," he muttered. Frank didn't argue. They skirted the perimeter, their eyes averted from the haunting scene. The city felt like a graveyard as they walked past familiar landmarks now steeped in decay. They approached the Regal Coin Exchange, its windows shattered. Inside, the counters were empty, except for scattered loose change. The metallic smell of blood lingered in the air, and Alan pocketed a few silver coins without a word before they moved on. They stopped at Waters Cafe to check for food. The small eatery had been ransacked, but they found a few unopened water bottles and a half-full bag of coffee beans. "Better than nothing," Frank said, slipping the finds into his bag. As they neared the penny saver market, a plume of black smoke rose into the sky. The entire store was ablaze, flames licking hungrily at the walls. Burning zombies stumbled through the parking lot, their charred bodies emitting an acrid stench. Alan and Frank detoured around the inferno, their pace quickening. "This whole area is going up," Alan said, glancing back at the spreading fire. Dee's Bonton's restaurant was their next stop. The doors were ripped off their hinges, the interior a gutted shell, shelves lay overturned, and not a single scrap of food remained. "They cleaned this place out," Frank said, kicking aside an empty can. "Figures," Alan replied. "Let's keep moving." The encounters with the undead began to intensify as the sun climbed higher. A group of 3 zombies stumbled out from behind an overturned truck, their rotting hands clawing at the air. Alan and Frank worked in tandem, their hatchets flashing in the sunlight. Blood splattered the pavement as the undead fell, one after another. "You okay?" Frank asked, breathing hard. "Yeah," Alan said, wiping his blade on his pants. "Let's keep moving." They passed a playground near Daffin Park, the swings creaking eerily in the breeze. A lone zombie staggered near the slide, its movements mechanical. Frank dispatched it with a clean swing of his hatchet, the blade slicing through its neck. "That never gets less creepy," Frank muttered, watching the severed head roll across the grass. Alan grunted in agreement. "Let's pick up the pace, sun's going down." By the time they reached Tom's property, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting the sky in deep red and purple hues. The main gate loomed ahead, its steel frame a reassuring sight. Alan and Frank stopped a few yards away, their bodies aching from the day's journey. "Looks intact," Alan said, scanning the gate and fence. Frank nodded. "Think he's home?" "Only one way to find out," Alan replied. He stepped forward, raising his voice. "Tom, you in there?" For a moment there was nothing but silence. Then the faint sound of movement from within the property. Alan and Frank exchanged a glance, their hands tightening on their hatchets. "Tom," Alan called again, louder this time. "It's Alan and Frank! From the office!" A floodlight suddenly snapped on, illuminating the gate and the 2 men. They squinted against the brightness, instinctively raising their hands. "That you, Alan?" A familiar voice called out. Alan felt a wave of relief. "Yeah, it's us! Let us in, man." The gate began to slide open, the sound of metal grinding against metal echoing in the twilight. As they stepped inside, Tom appeared, his AR-15 slung over his shoulder. His face was as stoic as ever, but there was a flicker of relief in his eyes. "Took you long enough," he said, a hint of a smirk on his lips. Alan and Frank chuckled, the day's tension finally beginning to ease. But as the gate closed behind them and the last rays of sunlight disappeared, they knew the real fight was just beginning. Tom led Alan and Frank through the secure gate, the heavy clang of metal sealing behind them a comforting sound. The world outside was chaos, but within the confines of Tom's property, there was a semblance of order, and the solar panels gleamed under the dim floodlights. As they approached the house, the aroma of something warm and hearty wafted through the air. "You guys look like hell," Tom said, smirking as he unlocked the door. "Come on, let's get you fed and cleaned up." Alan and Frank exchanged a look, their shoulders sagging in relief. The tension of the day's journey melted slightly as they entered the house. The interior was surprisingly comfortable, a stark contrast to the devastation outside. The lights glowed softly, and the kitchen table was set with plates and steaming bowls of stew. "Get cleaned up first," Tom said, motioning toward the hallway. "Shower's down there. Towels and clean clothes are in the closet." Alan hesitated. "You sure? Feels wrong to relax with everything going on." Tom shook his head. "You've earned it. Trust me, you don't want to eat like that." The hot water cascaded over Alan's skin, washing away the grime and blood of the past few days. He closed his eyes, letting the steam envelop him. For a moment, He allowed himself to forget the horrors outside. He felt almost human again when he emerged, clean and wrapped in a towel. Frank followed suit, emerging from his shower with a wide grin. "I don't think I've ever appreciated hot water this much," he said, running a hand through his damp hair. When they returned, Tom was already seated at the table. He gestured for them to sit, pushing bowls of stew their way. The rich aroma made their stomachs growl. Alan and Frank didn't hesitate, digging in with gusto. The food was simple but satisfying, the warmth spreading through them with every bite. "So," Tom said, leaning back in his chair, "what happened to you guys?" Alan set his spoon down, his expression darkening. "It started slow," he began. "The first day, we thought it was just another scare. You know how the news blows things out of proportion. But then it got real. People started getting sick and attacking each other. It was too late when we realized what was happening." Frank nodded. "We were at the office when it hit. The streets were chaos, cars crashing, people screaming. We barricaded ourselves in, but we could hear them outside. The zombies." Alan's voice grew quieter. "We lost a couple of the guys. Was. They went out to check on their families and never came back. We tried to hold on, but the supplies ran out faster than we thought. That's when we decided to go here. We figured if anyone had a chance, it was you." Tom nodded, his face unreadable. "You made the right call. It's been bad all over. The city's gone. I've been watching the feeds. It's like something out of a nightmare." Frank leaned forward. "What about you? How have you been holding up?" Tom sighed, running a hand over his face. "It's been a lot of watching and waiting. I've got the supplies to last, but the most challenging part is doing nothing. Just sitting here, knowing the world's falling apart." As the conversation continued, the three men began to share more. Tom recounted the early days of the outbreak, how he fortified his property and watched from his roof as the world descended into madness. Alan and Frank listened, their respect for him growing with every word. "You always were prepared," Alan said with a faint smile. "Guess that military training came in handy." Tom's expression darkened. "It's not something I'm proud of. Taking lives even in self-defense, it stays with you." Frank's gaze dropped to his hands. "I get that. On the way here, we had to do things. People weren't just dying. They were turning on each other. We ran into a couple of guys who wanted our supplies. They didn't give us a choice." The room fell silent. The weight of their experiences hung heavy in the air. Later that evening, after the dishes were cleared and the lights dimmed, the three men sat in the living room nursing cups of coffee. The conversation turned to lighter topics, memories of better days. "Remember that big job we had on Wheeler Street?" Frank said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "The one where the owner wouldn't stop micromanaging us?" Alan laughed. "Oh, yeah. What was his name? Mr. Jenkins? Kept telling us how to do our jobs, even though he couldn't tell a hammer from a screwdriver." Tom chuckled, shaking his head. "I remember. He offered me a cigar as a bonus for finishing on time." The shared laughter was a brief respite, a reminder of the lives they once had. As the night wore on, they returned to the topic of survival. Alan spoke of his regrets, the people he couldn't save, the things he couldn't do. Frank shared stories of close calls, moments when he thought it was the end. And Tom, ever stoic, listened quietly, his own demons reflected in his eyes. "You think there's any hope?" Alan asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Tom didn't answer immediately. He stared into his coffee, his expression thoughtful. "I don't know. But there's a chance as long as we're still breathing." Frank nodded. "Yeah, and if anyone can make it through this, it's us." The three men sat silently, their shared determination filling the room. The world outside was dark and unforgiving, but together, they knew they had a fighting chance. The four men sat around the heavy oak table in the bunker's main room. The dim light from a single overhead bulb cast long shadows across their tired faces. Empty plates and mugs were scattered across the table, remnants of another night spent discussing their next move. Tom leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "I don't see the point in leaving," he said, his voice steady. "We've got food, water, and safety here. Everything we need to ride this out." Mark nodded in agreement. "Tom's right. Out there, it's a death sentence. We've seen what it's like." Alan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "It's not about safety," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "It's about not knowing. My girlfriend Lisa, I don't know if she's alive or dead. She could be out there waiting for me, hoping I'll come for her." Tom's expression hardened. "Alan, you know as well as I do that the odds of her surviving are slim. If she's out there, she's probably—" "Don't," Alan snapped, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the table's edge. "Don't you dare say it?" Frank broke the tense silence. "I get it, Alan," he said quietly. "I've been thinking about my mom. She's all alone at her place on the south side. I can't just sit here while she might need me." Tom sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Frank, your mother's house is miles away, through God knows what. You're risking your life for a maybe? The same goes for you, Alan. You don't even know if Lisa made it past day one." Alan's jaw tightened. "Maybe I don't, but I have to try." "And I can't abandon her," Frank added, his voice resolute. "She's my mother." Mark shook his head. "This is insane. You've seen the streets. You've seen what's out there. It's suicide." "Maybe it is," Alan said, "but I'd rather die trying than live with the regret of doing nothing." The conversation stretched late into the night, but Tom knew their minds were made up. No amount of reasoning or pleading would change that. When the discussion finally ended, Alan and Frank packed their things in silence, their determination set on their faces. The following day, Tom stood by the bunker door, a rifle slung over his shoulder. He handed each of them a small backpack filled with food, water, and basic supplies. He gave them each a handgun, extra ammo sticks, and packs. "This is all I'm giving you," he said, his tone sharp. "If you're going to throw your lives away, at least do it armed." Alan nodded, slipping the gun into the waistband of his jeans. "Thanks, Tom, for everything." Frank clasped Tom's hand briefly. "We'll come back, you'll see." Tom didn't respond. He watched as they stepped out into the early morning light, their figures disappearing beyond the gate. Mark stood beside him, his expression a mix of anger and sorrow. "They're not coming back, are they?" Mark asked. Tom's silence was answer enough. The first few hours of Alan and Frank's journey were filled with tense silence. The streets were eerily quiet, the air heavy with the scent of decay. They moved cautiously, their eyes scanning every shadow and corner for movement. "Do you really think we'll find them?" Frank asked eventually, his voice barely above a whisper. Alan hesitated. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I have to believe we will. Otherwise, what's the point?" Frank nodded. "Yeah, what's the point?" The day stretched on, the sun climbing higher in the sky. They passed abandoned cars, some with doors ajar, others with shattered windows. Occasionally they saw zombies trapped inside, their decayed faces pressed against the glass as they snarled and clawed. The first real encounter came near a burned-out grocery store. 3 zombies emerged from the shadows, their movements slow but purposeful. Alan raised his gun, firing 2 quick shots. One of the creatures dropped, its head snapping back as the bullet tore through its skull. Frank dispatched the other 2 with his hatchet, the blade sinking into rotted flesh with a sickening crunch. They moved on, their nerves frayed but their resolve unshaken. By midday, they reached a small park where they stopped to rest. Alan leaned against a tree, his gaze distant. "Lisa used to love this place," he said quietly. "We'd come here on weekends just to sit and talk. It feels like a lifetime ago." Frank didn't respond immediately. When he spoke, his voice was heavy. "My mom, she used to make the best cornbread, every Sunday without fail. I'd give anything to sit at her table again." Alan placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. "We'll find her, Frank. We'll find them both." As the sun set, they continued, the shadows growing longer and more menacing. The streets felt even more dangerous in the fading light. They passed a church with its doors wide open, the interior dark and foreboding. From within, faint noises echoed, the unmistakable groans of the undead. "Keep moving," Alan whispered, his grip tightening on his gun. Frank nodded, his eyes darting nervously. "Let's hope we make it to morning." The 2 men pressed on as the darkness enveloped them, their silhouettes fading into the night. 6 months had passed since the world ended. The sun rose over Tom's property, its light filtered through a haze of dust and decay. What had once been a suburban home was now a fortress. The perimeter was reinforced with makeshift barriers constructed from scrap metal and salvaged wood. Cars from nearby streets had been pushed against the outer fence to create a secondary wall, their fuel siphoned and stored in a growing stockpile. Tom stood on the roof, his AR-15 slung over his shoulder as he scanned the horizon through binoculars. The land around them was quiet, but he had learned never to trust the calm. Below, Mark was working with a torch, welding additional reinforcements to the front gate. His wife and kids tended to a small garden they had managed to cultivate in a cleared patch of the yard. "Anything?" Mark called up, wiping sweat from his brow. Tom shook his head. "Clear. For now." Mark nodded and returned to his work, the hiss of the torch cutting through the morning air. The system they had built was rudimentary but effective. Each person had their role, and they worked tirelessly to ensure their survival. Inside the bunker, the shelves were still stocked, but the supplies were carefully rationed. The scavenging runs had become more dangerous as the months wore on. The streets were littered with the remains of humanity, abandoned cars, crumbling buildings, and the ever-present threat of the undead. Tom and Mark took turns venturing out, always armed and cautious. One such run proved particularly fruitful. While searching the highway on the city's outskirts, they came across an abandoned fuel tanker. Its bulk loomed on the horizon, a giant among the wreckage. Approaching cautiously, they discovered the tank was nearly complete, a rare find in a world running dry. "This could keep us going for months," Mark said, running a hand along the tanker's cold metal surface. "If we can figure out how to get it home," Tom replied, his mind already working through the logistics. They scoured the nearby area, finding several large containers in the back of a delivery truck. The plastic barrels were dusty but intact, and they spent the better part of an hour transferring the fuel. Using a hand pump they had scavenged weeks earlier, they filled each barrel, the faint sloshing of liquid, a strangely hopeful sound in the desolation. Transporting the barrels back to the compound was another challenge. They improvised a makeshift wagon using parts from a nearby hardware store. An old dolly became the base, reinforced with plywood and tied with bungee cords and straps. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. Each trip back to the compound was slow and nerve-wracking, the wagon creaking under the weight of the barrels as they navigated the debris-strewn streets. "Feels like we're asking to get jumped," Mark muttered, glancing around as he pushed the wagon. Tom kept his rifle ready, his eyes scanning every shadow. "That's why I'm here." Despite the tension, they made it back without incident. The fuel was stored in a secure shed, adding to their growing stockpile. The success of the run buoyed their spirits, but Tom remained pragmatic. "It's a win," he said as they unloaded the last barrel, "but we can't get complacent." As the weeks turned into months, the group adapted. The children had learned to stay silent and alert, their playful innocence replaced with a wary awareness. Mark's wife, once hesitant to venture outside, had become adept at sorting through scavenged goods, finding hidden treasures among the wreckage. Tom, ever the sentinel, rarely rested. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on him. He often thought of Alan and Frank, wondering if they had survived. Their departure had left a void, a reminder of the cost of hope in a hopeless world. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the group gathered around a small fire in the yard. The children were asleep in the bunker, leaving the adults to talk. Mark passed a can of beans around, and the simple meal was a luxury in their new reality. "You think it'll ever get better?" Mark's wife asked, her voice soft. Tom stared into the flames, his expression unreadable. "I don't know, but we're still here. That's something." Mark nodded. "As long as we're breathing, there's a chance." The fire crackled, the sound filling the silence. They had become a family, bound by necessity and shared hardship. The world outside was dark and unforgiving, but within the walls of their fortress, there was a flicker of hope. That night, Tom stood watch on the roof, his rifle resting against the parapet. The stars were bright, their light undimmed by city glow. The world was quieter now, its chaos stilled by the weight of its collapse. But Tom knew better than to trust the quiet. He would stand guard as always, ready for whatever came next. Because in a world like this, survival wasn't just a goal. It was a fight, and as long as he drew breath, Tom would keep fighting.